On today's show, a pre-draft mailbag as we are almost there. It is draft week now officially as I record this on Sunday evening into Monday. Draft questions, the latest news, and more coming up.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1263 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Sunday evening into Monday. And today's show is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered the season with more odds, props, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. And today's podcast will be myself talking about all kinds of little things. We've had some mailbag questions come in the last week or two. Also, some news to hit on at the top of the podcast, but wall-to-wall coverage of the NBA draft. As I sort of teased before, the draft is this week. Thursday evening is the draft. We're officially there as I record this, only a few days away. Plenty of rumblings out there, of course, that I've been touching on along the way, but the Hawks currently still have the same picks they've had the entire way, and I'm going to have my final thoughts later on in the week about the actual board as it is right now. But between this podcast, that podcast, and also some guests that are scheduled to join me in the near future. I'm not sure if I can guarantee how many or who they are at this point, but I have some things lined up for sure. And crunch time, as I would say, in the NBA world. But please subscribe to the podcast. Check us out across platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, also YouTube on the video side. And I've had plenty of great content in recent days. If you're just catching up now because the draft's getting closer, I don't necessarily blame you, but please join us all the time. And as a reminder, we've had Glenn Willis on the show for a ton of player capsule series, deep dives talking about Capela and John Collins and DeAndre Hunter, up and down the roster. Everybody except for Trae Young so far has been touched on with myself and Glenn. Also some draft coverage with guys like Ben Pfeiffer and Ricky O'Donnell. I had Brian Schroeder on the podcast last week with a two-part deep dive. I had Andrew Kelly on some trade stuff earlier in the process as well. All kinds of coverage. And please subscribe, catch up, and all that fun stuff right now. As for today's podcast, a little bit of news here at the top of the show. Chris Jent, old friend and long-tenured Hawks assistant coach, is going to be no longer on the Hawks staff, according to a report from Adrian Wojnarowski of ESPN. Jent's going to join the Lakers staff under Darvin Ham, of course, who is a former Hawks assistant. And as a sidebar, lots of Hawks assistants under Budenholzer have been certainly getting jobs around the league. If you've been counting at home, that's, of course, you have Budenholzer first. You have Kenny Atkinson, Quinn Snyder, now Darvin Ham, Taylor Jenkins in Memphis is a former Hawks assistant. So it's been a very busy time for Hawks assistants, let's just say, at least former Hawks assistants. At any rate, Jent going to coach the Lakers alongside Darvin. He was the longest tenured guy from the Hawks. He was hired in 2017 in the summer, so that was still Budenholzer. When he was brought in, he was the holdover between Bud and Lloyd Pierce's staff, and then also held over again between Pierce and McMillan. So all three coaches that he worked under in Atlanta. Also has a relationship with Darvin. They were on the bench together under Budenholzer with the Hawks. And he has a relationship with LeBron James because Jent was actually assistant coach in Cleveland when LeBron was still there. So lots of connections that kind of explain why he might go take this job. And as a reminder, Jent was the lead assistant this last year for the Hawks. It was Melvin Hunt before that. But then when he left, Jent was elevated to that number 2 role under McMillan. So keep an eye on all of that stuff. And the Hawks, of course, have an opening now to replace Jent. Obviously, assistant stuff's often not till later on in the cycle. The Hawks didn't lose Garnett until the end of last cycle, but between Melvin Hunt and Marlon Garnett last year, lots of turnover on the staff in the last couple of years, and we'll be interested to see who they bring in place of Chris Jent. But he's been credited with a lot of different stuff from the Hawks. Obviously, he got a lot of credit for John Collins' shooting development. He's been instrumental on the offensive development side. He's been a great game plan guy for the Hawks from what I experiences. And honestly, I've enjoyed my experiences with Chris Jent. We're not like close friends or anything, but I certainly think he's a competent, very smart, and a good guy from all accounts that I have heard and also experienced in person. So certainly a loss for the Hawks. I had a debate with someone online and offline actually about like how much this actually matters. I'm not saying this is a huge deal. It's not like losing a player, but certainly quality assistant coaches are notable in this league, and they certainly have some real value. So Jent, as a longtime guy, there's some stability there, and the Hawks have to now plug that hole that's now been created with him leaving to go to Los Angeles. Okay, that's all of the news. In fact, I'm kind of surprised by this, but there really has not been any like new, even like I'm not using the word rumors with any of this stuff just yet. No real rumblings on the Hawks front just yet on the trade side that's not already happened. Obviously, the Gobert stuff's still out there, the DeAndre Ayton stuff's still out there, etc. But nothing new in the last few days. So I'm going to breeze by a lot and kind of answer some questions now on today's podcast. So first question comes from Will, who asks, did you find the BetOnline's odds disrespectful to the Hawks? And he says, I was surprised when I saw what you tweeted. So for some background to answer Will's question, our partners at BetOnline released 2023 title odds a few days ago, and I shared them on Twitter. I have to go ahead and give the caveat that the offseason basically hasn't even started yet. So at the same time, there is some projection in these numbers. Obviously, future odds are always projection. These are very early. It seems like early and earlier the books come up with the interesting future odds here. But alas, both like health stuff is still out there, transaction stuff still out there. And one example of this, by the way, is that the Clippers, who have not had their key guys, at least Kawhi Leonard, in quite a while, they're actually in the top 4 in title odds, whereas the Suns finished number 1 in the league this year in regular season, and actually they're number 6 in the title odds because of DeAndre Ayton stuff and all that stuff, Chris Paul's age, etc. So as far as the Hawks are concerned, Atlanta is 66-1 to win the NBA title right now. For comparison's sake, BetOnline included last year's preseason odds for all the teams in the same release they issued this year's odds. And last year, preseason, the Hawks were were actually 28-1. So this year, their odds are more than double as long before the season starts. Obviously, not coming off the conference finals run, we'll kind of do that in some respects, and a lot more uncertainty with the roster than there was a year ago. But the Hawks right now are behind 7 teams in the Eastern Conference and 17 teams overall in the NBA. And Atlanta at 66-1 is the only team that has those odds, but 17 teams that are ahead of them in the odds to win the title. No other team has the same odds again. Pretty modest. I can see why Hawks fans wouldn't like that necessarily. I got some reaction as a result of that. But the Hawks are behind the Celtics, Nets, Bucks, Heat, Sixers, Bulls, and Raptors in that order among Eastern Conference teams. And other teams the Hawks are listed behind that might be controversial in the West, like the Pelicans, the Jazz, and the T-Wolves are all ahead of the Hawks in terms of future-facing odds. One thing, I would not be taking this too seriously at this point as a flat-out projection, because it's always, as a reminder, odds makers are trying to get money on these teams and kind of make these numbers based on – there's stuff as projection in there as well, but they want to get team quality as well as action in the mix. So keep that in mind always with this kind of number. And a lot can change. If the Hawks make a big move, their numbers will probably change on some level. And there's so much uncertainty now with how much the Hawks have been tied to different guys that maybe that's baked in as well. At the same time, just a reminder, the Hawks were a play-in team this year. And they basically are projected where they finished last year. They were number 8 in the playoffs. They were number 8 now in the Eastern Conference. And the teams that are ahead of them were the teams that were ahead of them. So keep that all in mind as well. I think the Hawks are better than they were last year, even as constructed right now. I will say that again. The Hawks are better now on paper than they were last year, but they still lost those games last season. And I think that reflects that, as well as they got kind of waxed in that playoff series by the Heat. So that's all kind of in the mix here as well. I'll be curious to see how all things move as the offseason arrives. But this is not too crazy in my mind. I think the Hawks would be a little higher if it was me. Like, I think they have a better chance of winning the title this year than the Pelicans do, for instance. Maybe even like the Wolves. I'm not sure. The Bulls for sure. I'd probably pick the Hawks ahead of. But still, if they don't make a major overhaul, I'd be fascinated to see where these projections kind of land on the Hawks in a few weeks as we get into like mid-July when we see what the roster actually looks like. But at this point in time, nothing to be too worried about. But I want to at least touch on that since it was asked by a couple of people. And a question from Will. Thank you for asking that question. Okay. In a pro kind of transition here, I'm going to tell you about the folks at BetOnline, who I just talked about a little bit, but the NBA season is actually over, of course, at BetOnline and elsewhere, but the fun never stops at BetOnline, and there are plenty to focus on the sports world at this point in time. There was a major golf tournament that finished up on Sunday, and our partners at BetOnline have the number one source for all of your betting needs across the sports world. That's the latest odds, news, and developments, including the Stanley Cup Finals, which are ongoing right now, Major League Baseball stuff, odds, scores, etc., the latest fight stuff, and futures. As I mentioned a second ago, NBA futures are already out, NFL, college football, college basketball, all that stuff and more at BetOnline. At BetOnline, you continue to source from all the wagering information. That includes live betting and esports and poker and casino games and much more beyond that. And the other sports that are always there at BetOnline, if you're into like sort of more of the fringe outlets, they have, of course, hockey's more prominent and golf is prominent this weekend. They have tennis and auto racing and horse racing, soccer, cricket, entertainment bets, and all the sports you can think of. It's probably at BetOnline if you want to check it out today. Head there right now on your mobile device or on your computer to learn more about all the trends and the action across the sports world. BetOnline, where the game starts. Back to the mailbag now as we get some more questions to answer on the show. And the question that I'm going to answer now comes from AB, who asks me to settle a bet between his friend and him. And the question is Clint Capela worth more now to the Hawks in a trade than what the Hawks paid for him in a trade? And this question comes from listening to myself and Glenn, he says. So thanks for the inspiration. Thanks for the question. And I would definitely, again, plug the deep dive I've been doing with Glenn on all these different players, including Capela. That was a fun one. I think we're higher than Capela than most people, and I definitely understand that. But I think we do a good job on that pod of talking about what he actually is as a player, positively and negatively at this point in time. But at any rate, the question is interesting because I think the Hawks got a very good value deal on the original trade to get Capela, which is basically getting him for a mid-first round pick and some salary matching. That's an appropriate deal. It was a good value when they did it, and it worked out very well for the Hawks when that actually happened and beyond. So the short answer, I think the Hawks would be doing it probably similarly right now in terms of trade value when they actually traded for him, which I'm not sure sells the debate that you are having with your friend, but I'm going to come back with more information in a second, kind of present that to you. The extension is what is interesting here. So Capela would probably be worth more now than he was then, if not for the extension, but maybe even with the extension. So it's $43 million in extra money for 2 years. It's not starting until after next season for Capela. On one hand, again, could actually add some value because a lot of teams value those good players that are locked up on long-term contracts with all of the movement that already happens in the NBA. And part of the calculus in my mind and what I've actually heard about that was that it made Capela even more tradable long-term when they wanted to go ahead and move on from him at some point. On the other side, you could argue if you wanted to, that Capela has been a little bit banged up the last couple of years. He'll be 31 at the end of that deal. So a lot of miles on the tires, may not be the greatest end of that extension in the world potentially if he's not the same player that he is now. But I think he's still worth that contract in a big way right now. In fact, right now he's underpaid for this year. He's actually going to make about $18 million for next season. He's worth much more than that right now. I would probably say something in like $25 million range for Capela, maybe even a little bit higher than that based on his value the last 2 years. He's not a max guy, but he's probably in the next tier down of what he's actually worth. And the 2 years after that are the real question here, whether he's worth the $20 million 2 years from now or the $22 million 3 years from now for Capela. So basically, if the Hawks were to move Capela by himself right now, I would expect a pretty similar deal in return to what they actually paid for him. So like a first round pick and some filler salary, or like a good starting caliber player with like a throw in alongside that. So it's kind of tough to do that in a vacuum, but that's kind of what he's worth at this point in time. So if I had to answer the question and settle the bet that I was asked to settle, I would say I would go with him being worth more now in a trade because he was hurt when he was actually acquired by the Hawks. And he's established now as I think 2 years ago was his best year of his career. He was awesome, and last year was pretty good as well, especially in the second half of the season. He was really good. So I think he's been like a top 10 or 12 center in the league the last 2 years. And with less questions about the health and also the Rockets, people kind of forget this, but the Rockets were very, very desperate to trade him when they did because they were trying to pave the way for Russell Westbrook, which is kind of funny now in retrospect. But I think overall, it's pretty close to the same value, which is probably a good sign for the Hawks. You got 2 years of value from Capela, but I think if I had to guess, I would say he has a little bit more value trade-wise than he used to have, at least when he was acquired a couple of years ago. Okay, next question comes from a listener named D, who asked, with the news about Jalen Johnson's injury, does that change anything when it comes to off-season plans? So if anybody missed this, Johnson had a non-surgical procedure on his left knee for some tendonitis, and the Hawks announced that last week on the show. I just sort of like a bonus podcast about that and Bogdanovich and other things. No timeline specifically on Johnson's return, but the Hawks are saying that he's expected to be back in full by training camp. So that's still like 3 months away, but that gives him some time to ramp up. Summer League probably out the window for Johnson at this point in time, but provided all that is accurate and he's actually healthy when the season starts, I think it probably doesn't change much at all when it comes to the actual offseason plan for the Hawks. Now, there could be some Hawks fans, in fact, I know that there are, that are already dreaming about Johnson being a starting four next year. That's not going to happen, I don't think, in terms of like opening day. I think Johnson could be a starter long term. I've been very high on that draft pick the entire way through. I love that draft value. I thought he looked good in the G League this year, for instance. But I think going into his second season with how little experience he has at the NBA level, you can't bank on Johnson on a team that's trying to win being your starter next year. Even if they were to move on from Collins, they have to replace him with more than just Johnson. Now, I think the Hawks weren't going to do that anyway, though, so keep that in mind. And that kind of answers the question about how much is going to change the offseason plans. I think that maybe you want to bring a veteran in a little bit more urgently than you might have before. I think the Hawks were probably going to do that anyway, but I think Johnson's going to get a lot of playing time this year as probably a backup to start with. Maybe he impresses a lot. But I think with everyone expecting Gallo to be gone, nothing guaranteed, but I think everyone to a man that I've heard from or talked to seems to think Gallo's not going to be back with the Hawks. If they had to guess, there's more likely to have some minutes there for Johnson at some point in time, and there's definitely a clear role behind those guys in the front court. But the interesting thing for me, again, is kind of what you do around him at the four spot. If Collins is still here, then that he's obviously your starting four, and I'm not going to get into all that stuff again here on the Collins front. But I do think that if Collins doesn't move, I wonder if they go with Johnson as like the primary backup four, or if they give him another option to McMillan, like more of a fringy veteran type, like your Solomon Hill kind of guy, maybe a little bit higher than that, even on the totem pole. But I do think that Jalen should be, if he is healthy, carving out a role that's more definitive for next year. But in terms of the plan for the offseason, I think you kind of have to go in thinking he's the backup four rather than the starting four, and that probably doesn't change based on the injury or anything beyond that. Okay. Next question comes from Cameron, who asks, this is kind of a funny question. He says, this is not totally Hawks related, but can you explain to me why the Kings and Blazers are apparently looking to trade their draft picks? Is it a media thing or is it actually real? I'll try to answer this now, and I will. I generally, though, agree with the tone of the question that it's kind of weird in a vacuum to have two teams in the top 7 of the NBA draft that are actually widely reported to be trying to trade those picks for present day help. That's kind of bizarre in nature. I'll start with the Blazers, though, because it actually makes at least a little bit more sense for me with Portland. It seems to be a situation where the Blazers are not ready to move on from Damian Lillard just yet. And he's actually a franchise icon, so I do understand that. He is the kind of player, like, he'll be in the Hall of Fame one day. And to keep him happy, I would not, I don't necessarily blame them for trying to be competitive after a disaster year last year. It's not the greatest thing in the world. It's probably not what I would do with the franchise, but Lillard's been good enough where it isn't completely insane to try to build a good team around him. Are they going to be a title contender? No, they're not. But they made a conference finals with Lillard as the best player, and they have some guys on the roster with your Anthony Simons and your Josh Harts, and your Nurkic is a guy they can bring back for a pretty reasonable price probably. So, and whoever they trade the pick for if they were to go ahead and do that. Still, I don't know why you would do that. Personally, I would personally not do that if I was the Blazers. I would probably just draft somebody and try to build for the future, but that's not where they are at this point, it seems. On the Kings side, it's the Kings being the Kings, I think. Sacramento's not been in the playoffs since I was a sophomore in college, which that's a long time. I'm not a young man anymore. And I think that present-day talent-wise, they do have some players with De'Aaron Fox and Harrison Barnes and Sabonis, but they're clearly not ready to compete this year, and it's kind of crazy to me for them to be shopping that pick for future-facing help. For present-facing help, especially because this draft is kind of a top 4 kind of tier. Not everyone agrees with that, but I think generally speaking, it's seen as a top 4 in some order, where there's probably a pretty big gap after the top 4. That's definitely how I see it in terms of my overall value proposition on this draft. So keep that in mind as I evaluate this. But at 7 with Portland, that's an area of the draft that I don't necessarily love. So that makes it a little bit easier for Portland to go ahead and move off that pick. At 4, you're going to get one of those top 4 guys no matter what happens. Now, you could say that Jaden Ivey is not a great fit with what you have for the Kings. Like if you have De'Aaron Fox and you still believe in him, Davion Mitchell, etc., that's not a great fit. But I think personally for me, it's not enough to scare me off of drafting Jaden Ivey. And also, you could just trade. If that happens, if that happens on draft night, maybe you just take him anyway and just kind of build with him anyway. I think you just go best player available. You're the Kings. You're not anywhere close to being competitive anyway. So for me, Blazers, I kind of get it. Kings, I absolutely do not get it. And hopefully that answers your question, but at least try to give you both sides on both teams. Okay, last question I'm going to answer on today's podcast. Probably a little bit shorter episode, so my apologies on that. But alas, we're getting up and sort of ramping into things, and it's a Sunday into Monday, etc. Question comes from Sebastian, who says, is there a deal that you would actually do with the Blazers for John Collins? I find myself agreeing with you with listening to your podcast with the Portland guy, and I didn't think you said a deal that you would actually do in real life. So if you've heard this podcast already, ignore this part. But if you've not heard it just yet, I actually talked to Mike Richmond of Locked On Blazers and dropped that in my feed over the weekend. Mike asked me to come on, so it's him hosting. It's more Portland focused, but I talked about John Collins and like what I see about John Collins as a player and some of the rumblings there, and give some insight on John and sort of the value proposition. We got into all that stuff. So not to spoil the whole thing, but Mike was asking about the construction around number 7 for Collins and basically using Eric Bledsoe as the salary filler in that deal. And that personally is something that I would not be interested in doing, which is something I did say on that show. I was candid with him. I don't love that construction overall, and Bledsoe is part of the reason why. So I alluded to this, but there is some potential with the Blazers, I think, if you are just dead set on trading Collins. For me, though, it has to include Josh Hart. So I personally value Collins a little bit more than number 7 overall in this draft, and that informs some of my thinking because number 7 is a pretty flat range for me in this draft. I'm not sure how much better that pick is than like 9, 10, 11 in this class, but keep that in mind. So through that lens, I would not do the Collins for 7 archetype in a vacuum anyway. And Eric Bledsoe is strongly negative salary. Now, he's not a useless player, but he's not worth what he's making now. And you have to make that deal, make him basically guaranteed in order to make that trade 1-for-1 in terms of salary matching purposes. So that deal, so his presence makes the deal worse. So if I already would not do Collins for 7, as I would not, I think it's fairly close. I'm not going to say you're crazy for doing that. Just for the record, I said on that show with Mike as well. But when you throw in Bledsoe, that becomes a bad deal in terms of a value proposition because Bledsoe has negative salary. So as I say this, the Blazers do have to actually match salary in the deal. So that's why Bledsoe might be in the deal. But if that happens, for me, Portland's got to throw something else in that has some value, whether it's a future pick or Nas Little or something like that. Somebody's got to sweeten the pot a little bit for the Hawks. The other way to do that is to have Josh Hart, who makes about $13 million this year, be the matching salary in the deal. Now, I am pretty high on Josh Hart, and I think he's a starting level player, honestly, on a good contract. So that would definitely help the Hawks. But the Blazers, as we talked about with Mike, probably don't want to include him if they don't have to, because he's going to help them this year. But he is not negative salary in the way that Bledsoe is. And I think he's not like overwhelmingly positive salary either. He's good salary in my mind, but nothing crazy in terms of value for what he's actually worth. So the real way to get me interested at all in a Collins Blazers swap, personally, if I'm evaluating the deal, would be to get 7 and Hart in the deal. Even if the Hawks had to include something smaller alongside Collins, whether it's like a second rounder or 2 or something like that, that is kind of fair in my mind. Now, would the Blazers do that? I kind of think probably not, which is kind of why I think this is not a deal that I would probably be involved with. But if I'm the Hawks, my first offer is probably something like, if I'm doing this, by the way, that's a huge caveat, would be like Collins and a second round pick for 7 and Josh Hart, or Collins and something else small, maybe at the absolute most, the Charlotte pick. I would not do 7 and 16 for Hart and number 7, because the 16 this year has more value than the Charlotte pick does. For one, that's a pick that's now that is 16. With Charlotte's pick, the best it can possibly ever be is 15. There's no way upside. I mean, if it's a future-facing pick, oftentimes you want to hold out and aim for value, but that pick never becomes less than lottery protected. So that pick is going to have to be 15 or worse. This year's 16 pick has more value than that pick in my mind. So I think the absolute most I would possibly do in a deal for Collins to the Blazers, this is me again talking, would be Collins and the Charlotte pick for 7 and Hart. I still would not be like over the moon about that, but that's a reasonable, fair deal that I would do probably if I was just deciding that Collins had to be off my team, which I am not deciding that. But alas, that's some interesting context there. So if you want me to find a deal, that's the one for me. I don't think Mike would have done that on the Blazers side. So again, that's kind of one of those, like, I had to be holding kind of things, because again, I think 7 and Collins have similar value. I would lean to Collins there. I know people would lean to 7. I do kind of understand that on both sides, but just keep in mind, I know I get accused of probably overweighting some of this stuff, but Eric Bledsoe as salary matching is a negative. That's a strong negative, and that matters. Even in a one-season sample, with the Hawks up against the luxury tax, that even matters even more. So you're not even saving money in that scenario, at least in the short term. Keep that all in mind as we were going through all this stuff. But again, I'm a little bit higher on Collins and probably a little bit lower on number 7 than people are in this class, and that probably informs my thinking on this front. Okay, that'll be it for today's podcast. Definitely shorter than usual on the show today, and my apologies for that. But we're going to have much more in the future. I'm going to give my full thoughts on the class as a whole at the end of the week, probably like Wednesday, unless the Hawks trade their pick before then, which might happen, I guess. But something along those lines about like who I'm valuing in 16, probably my mini board in that range, maybe some trade up candidates, trade down candidates. I will sort of use as a spoiler there to think that actually I'm kind of a fan of trading down in some respects in this class. People don't necessarily love that in this draft, but other possibilities that might arise in the next couple of days. I'm sure there'll be some rumors out there between Sunday night when I'm recording this and Thursday night when the draft actually kicks off. So please stay tuned for all that stuff. Please subscribe to the podcast wherever you like to find your podcast at this point in time. And with all that said, we'll see you next time.